What would you do if a man broke into your home in the middle of the night, silent, calculated, carrying nothing but a hammer? That was a murderer, a mass killer, and a sexual predator. It was January 16, 1984, in Aurora, Colorado. A quiet, suburban neighborhood. Snow on the ground, houses asleep. Inside one of them, the Bennett family, Bruce, Debra, and their two young daughters, had just celebrated Melissa's upcoming 8th birthday. They laughed, ate cake, tucked the girls into bed, locked the doors, except for one, the garage door. By morning, 3 of them would be dead. Bruce was found at the foot of the stairs, his skull crushed, his throat slashed. Debra lay beaten to death in their bedroom. Melissa, just 7, had been brutally sexually assaulted and murdered. The youngest, Vanessa, only 3 years old, survived, barely. Her tiny body battered, broken, and scarred forever. It wasn't just a murder. It was a slaughter. Unrelenting. Personal. There was no known motive, no clear suspect. Just blood, horror, and the questions that would haunt investigators for decades. Who could commit such horror? What drives a person to kill with such fury and keep going? Was this calculated evil or chaos born from madness? How many lives were shattered before the killer vanished into the dark? And on top of that, would justice ever come for the innocent victims? This is the story of a hammer-wielding killer, a little girl who survived the unthinkable, and the 37 years' path to truth. This is the story of the Bennett family massacre. The victim's story. They were a family like any other, living on a quiet street in Aurora, Colorado, raising 2 daughters, planning birthday parties, dreaming of futures they'd never get to see. Bruce Bennett was born on April 26, 1956, in Denver. He grew up in a normal household with 2 brothers, Richard and Daniel. Nothing stood out about his childhood. Just a regular American boy who later joined the U.S. Navy, stationed at Pearl Harbor as a sonar analyst. After completing his service, Bruce returned home with one goal: to build a stable life. He began working in his family's furniture distribution business while studying to become an air traffic controller. To his family and friends, Bruce was steady, dependable, and endlessly devoted to his wife and daughters. Debra Bennett, Bruce's wife, was the oldest of 4 siblings. Her mother died when she was young, and from that moment, she stepped into the role of caregiver, helping her father, Ernest Large, a war veteran, raise the family. Life hardened her early, but it also made her fiercely compassionate. She met Bruce through her brother Larry, who happened to be his friend. Their connection was instant. They married young and deeply. Together, they managed the family business and built a life grounded in trust, hard work, and love. In 1983, after years of saving and sacrifice, Bruce and Debra finally purchased their first home in Aurora. The house was modest, but it was theirs. And for the Bennetts, it meant everything. Melissa, their first daughter, was born in January 1976. A vibrant, smart little girl who loved to laugh, she was approaching her 8th birthday in January 1984. Her mother had planned a school party later that week, the real birthday. Melissa called it. But on Sunday, January 15th, the family threw a small gathering at home. Grandparents came. Uncles came. There was cake, noise, laughter. That evening, one of the uncles reminded Bruce to close the garage door before bed. He nodded. But for reasons we'll never know, he didn't. Melissa went to bed that night giggling, full of cake and joy. She never made it to her actual birthday. Vanessa, the youngest, was born in 1981. Just 3 years old at the time, she was the baby of the family, curious, bright-eyed, and adored. She didn't understand fear. She didn't yet know what the world was capable of. In many ways, that night should have remained an ordinary childhood memory. But it didn't. From the outside, the Bennett family lived the American dream. No enemies. No debts. No feuds. They worked hard, loved each other, and minded their own business. They were exactly the kind of people no one could imagine something terrible happening to, and yet, it did. Later, investigators would confirm there were no personal motives. No grudges. The killer didn't know them. They were targeted simply because they left a door open. Their home, like many in the neighborhood, backed up to open space. No fence. No barrier. It was the kind of vulnerability the FBI profiler would later describe as ideal for a certain kind of predator. A killer who didn't need to break in, just walk in. What really happened? Monday morning, January 16, 1984. At Bassett Furniture, where Bruce and Debra Bennett worked, the phone rang. No one picked up. Bruce and Debra Bennett were never late. Never missed work. Especially not both at the same time. Something was wrong. Everyone at the store could feel it. But it was Bruce's mother, Connie Bennett, who truly knew. She'd just been with the family the night before. A simple early birthday party for Melissa. Connie remembered how the garage door was left open when she drove away, and she'd told herself it was nothing. But that morning, her gut screamed louder than logic. She got in her car and drove straight to their house in Aurora. When she arrived, the garage was still open. The house looked still. Too still. Connie stepped inside. What she saw stopped her heart. At the base of the staircase, lying in a pool of blood, was Bruce. His skull crushed, his throat slit deep, his body twisted like he'd fallen trying to reach something. Or someone. Connie ran out screaming, banging on the neighbor's door. Together, they called 911. What police found inside was worse than anything they'd ever seen. Debra Bennett was in the master bedroom, slumped at the edge of the bed. Her head had been bludgeoned repeatedly. No chance to scream. No time to fight. She was likely the first to die. In the children's room, Melissa's small body laid out, bruised and broken. Her face was covered by a child's blanket. Her legs positioned deliberately. Her clothes sliced open, not removed. She had been sexually assaulted with such violence it caused internal tearing. Just hours earlier, she had been the center of a birthday celebration. Now, she was the center of a crime scene. But then, another sound, a faint whimper. Barely there. A firefighter turned toward the wall. Between the bed and the drywall, curled into a crevice, was 3-year-old Vanessa. Barely alive. Her jaw was fractured, her skull, her ribs, her hips, all broken. She'd been hit so hard, they thought she was dead. But somehow, she wasn't. The doctors would later say, "It's a miracle she survived." In a quiet neighborhood, inside a loving home, someone had unleashed horror. A father beaten to death trying to protect. A mother struck in her sleep. A child violated beyond reason. And a baby girl was left for dead. No one knew who did it. But everyone now knew the killer was still out there, and he wasn't done. In the early investigation, the police arrived at a scene of extreme violence. The home showed no signs of forced entry. Investigators quickly sealed off the area and began collecting evidence. A kitchen knife was found lying in the snow outside. Deborah's purse had been ransacked. A set of bloody shoe prints, not belonging to any family member, was discovered inside the house. The murder weapon, suspected to be a 2-pronged hammer, was missing. The garage door had been left open, suggesting the killer entered through the rear of the house. Each victim's position helped piece together the sequence of attacks. Debra lay near the foot of her bed, likely the first to be killed. Melissa was discovered on the floor of the children's room, brutally raped and murdered. Her body staged with a blanket covering her face. Bruce was found at the bottom of the stairs, blood trailing from the hallway outside his daughter's room. Evidence showed he fought to protect his family. The level of brutality, paired with signs of sexual assault, pointed toward a calculated and sadistic killer. Nothing of value was taken, suggesting robbery was not the motive. Despite Deborah's ransacked purse, cash and valuables remained untouched. The violent sexual nature of Melissa's assault made it clear the attack was driven by deviance, not theft. Miraculously, Vanessa survived. She was discovered by a firefighter who heard faint moaning from behind the bed. She had suffered multiple fractures, jaw, skull, hip, legs, and a traumatic brain injury. There were signs of sexual assault. Her survival added a haunting dimension to the case. Police immediately questioned all family members and guests from the birthday party held the night before. Everyone had solid alibis. DNA samples were collected, though technology was primitive at the time. There were no financial disputes, affairs, or known enemies. The Bennetts were loved. Detectives quickly ruled out the possibility of domestic or known assailant. The killer was a stranger. The lack of forced entry and the open garage door indicated a killer who specifically targeted vulnerable homes. Profilers speculated the killer may have prowled neighborhoods looking for open garages. Investigators initially considered robbery, but it was soon ruled out. Nothing was missing. Then came the theory of a construction worker or handyman, someone with access to tools, knowledge of homes. Police checked local work crews, logged license plates of service vehicles in the area. No leads emerged. The brutal murders of the Bennett family sent a wave of horror through the quiet suburb of Aurora, Colorado. Bruce and Debra were seen as model citizens, hardworking, kind, and raising two bright young daughters in a peaceful neighborhood. When word spread that this family had been slaughtered inside their home, panic followed quickly. Neighbors were stunned. Many had known the Bennetts for years. They were just like any other family. And that was the terrifying part. If it can happen to the Bennetts, it can happen to anyone. For the first time in years, residents began locking their garage doors, installing alarm systems, and attending emergency community meetings with law enforcement. Sales of locks and home security systems soared in the weeks that followed. The fear was real, especially for those living near open spaces, just like the Bennetts. Aurora had always felt safe. That illusion was shattered. The media descended swiftly and with full force. Headlines blared across the state. Family slaughtered in Aurora suburb, child raped, 3 beaten to death, killer at large. Local outlets like the Denver Post and Rocky Mountain News covered the story relentlessly. As days passed without an arrest or motive, the press began asking hard questions. How could something so horrific happen with no warning? Who was walking among them, capable of this? The police were under immense pressure. Though they assured the public they were doing everything possible, frustration grew. Some questioned whether authorities were equipped to handle something so unprecedented. "We will not stop until we find whoever did this," declared the Aurora police chief. But within the department, some investigators privately admitted the case was unlike anything they'd seen. They didn't yet realize this horror was part of a broader series of crimes. The family's relatives were devastated. Connie Bennett, Bruce's mother, was the first to discover the crime scene. For days, she struggled with overwhelming guilt. "I should have done something." But she didn't give up. She became a persistent voice for justice, attending every community update and holding on to hope. Hundreds attended the Bennett's funeral. A large photo of the family stood at the center, surrounded by flowers and messages. "In loving memory of a family that represented everything good about this world." Over time, the case evolved from a local tragedy to a lasting symbol of innocence lost. For decades, it remained one of Colorado's most haunting unsolved crimes. Programs like Unsolved Mysteries, Cold Case Files, and countless podcasts would revisit the Bennett family again and again. To many, it came to define a chilling phrase: the perfect storm of innocence lost, brutality unleashed, and justice delayed. The links. From the very first day of the Bennett investigation, detectives in Aurora had an unsettling feeling. This wasn't an isolated crime. The brutality, the sexual assault, the way Melissa Bennett's body had been carefully staged with a blanket, it all pointed to a killer who had done this before. There was no forced entry. The attacker came through an open garage door, moved through the house, controlled the space, and executed a methodical, sadistic attack. That kind of violence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It evolves. 6 days earlier, on January 10, 1984, 50-year-old Patricia Louise Smith had been raped and murdered in her home in Lakewood, Colorado. She lived alone. Her daughter and gran found her body that afternoon, lying in the living room. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a blunt object, believed to be a hammer or a hatchet. Her clothing had been torn away, violent, intentional. Most disturbingly, her body had been posed and partially covered with a blanket. Just like Melissa. At the time, the Lakewood and Aurora police departments were working separately. But when investigators began comparing case notes, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Both scenes involved blunt, force trauma to the head. Both victims had been sexually assaulted and then posed post-mortem, covered by a blanket. Both homes showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. And both were located near open, access land with no rear fencing, easy for a predator to slip in unnoticed. The FBI was brought in shortly after the Bennett killings. Profilers believed Patricia Smith was likely the first victim in a series of escalating attacks. Unlike the Bennett case, Patricia's murder happened during the day, late morning, or early afternoon. This suggested the killer acted when opportunity presented itself, not just under cover of darkness. It also confirmed a terrifying fact: he didn't care about time or risk. Only access and vulnerability. Patricia stood out among the victims. She was the only adult woman in the chain of connected crimes. Other cases, like the Bennett murders, focused on children or young women. This inconsistency was telling. The killer wasn't targeting a type, he was targeting whoever he could get to. He wasn't stalking individuals. He was hunting. Her murder shook Lakewood. Patricia was a mother, a grandmother, a kind and respected woman. She had no enemies, no drama in her life. The attack on her felt random, but the details showed otherwise. Her home, like the Bennetts, backed onto open land. There were no witnesses. No forced entry. The killer had likely observed her, waited for the right moment, then struck with terrifying precision. The way she was covered, posed, meant something. And Melissa Bennett was staged the same way just 6 days later. Initially, the police didn't connect the two crimes. Different cities, different types of victims. But once the case files were shared and the crime scene details lined up, the connection became undeniable. This was the same man, the same monster. The beginning of a serial killer's spree. Moreover, this wasn't the only link. In the early morning hours of January 4, 1984, before the names Patricia Smith or the Bennetts made headlines, an eerie and violent attack unfolded in Henderson, Nevada, a quiet suburb near Las Vegas. The victims were the Haubenschild family: James, his wife Kimberly, and their young daughter. While the rest of the country was beginning the new year, this family was waking up to terror. The attacker slipped into the home through a sliding glass door, left unlocked. No forced entry, no broken glass. It was quiet, controlled, calculated. Once inside, the intruder moved swiftly. James was struck in the head with a blunt object while sleeping, likely a two-pronged hammer. Kimberly was attacked next, suffering similar injuries to her skull. Their daughter, just a child, was also hit in the head. Incredibly, all three survived. But the damage was done. When police arrived, they found a scene soaked in blood, but devoid of clear answers. Purses and wallets had been disturbed, but nothing was missing. There were no valuables taken, no indication of a robbery. One clue stood out: a set of bloody shoe prints, left behind by the suspect. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no clear motive. And at that time, there were no connections. The brutality of the attack shocked investigators. All three victims had been bludgeoned with tremendous force, targeting the head. The violence was intimate, up close, and intended to kill. But unlike the Colorado cases that would soon follow, there were no signs of sexual assault. The motivation wasn't clear, but the rage was undeniable. Early on, the crime also was treated as an isolated attempted triple homicide. Investigators had no reason to believe it was part of something larger. But the details, the unlocked back door, the use of a hammer, like weapon, the timing during sleep, and the presence of children among the victims would later match other crimes. Survivor testimony became a key piece of this puzzle. Kimberly Haubenschild later described the attacker as silent, focused, and unhesitant. He didn't say a word. He came to kill and left quickly. The behavior echoed reports from Colorado: methodical, detached, and frighteningly composed. Portrait the murderer. After the brutal Bennett family murders, the FBI was brought in to build a psychological and behavioral profile of the suspect. From the earliest days of the investigation, they observed unsettling consistencies. The killer always entered homes at night through unlocked doors. He used a blunt object, often a two-pronged hammer, to bludgeon victims, primarily targeting their heads. Despite the intense violence, nothing of value was taken. And in nearly every case, the killer covered the victims' bodies with blankets. To FBI profilers, that act of covering the bodies wasn't just about concealment. It represented symbolic behavior. It could suggest guilt, shame, or a deeply perverse need to maintain dominance over the victims, even after death. The killer's actions revealed an internal conflict, violently aggressive, but with a compulsive need to mask or control the aftermath. This pattern didn't just qualify as a modus operandi. It became a signature crime scene behavior, clear indicators that these weren't isolated crimes, but serial offenses committed by the same individual. The attacker showed a preference for suburban homes near open spaces, easy access points, like unlocked sliding doors or garages, and struck at times when victims were least able to defend themselves. In Colorado and Nevada, the same pattern emerged: silent entry, sudden and brutal hammer attacks, no theft, and post-mortem body staging. The bloody shoe prints, the only physical evidence linking the scenes. Found at the Bennett, Hobbinschild, and a Nevada scene, these prints shared similar size, tread pattern, and wear marks. The FBI documented them carefully, even though a national shoe print database didn't exist. Despite these behavioral insights, the investigation was riddled with challenges. DNA technology in 1984 was rudimentary. Semen collected from Melissa Bennett and Patricia Smith couldn't be processed effectively. Some samples were lost, while others degraded or became contaminated. This meant no biological identification could be made at the time. Investigators had to rely on behavior analysis and circumstantial clues rather than genetic evidence. A major problem was the lack of a centralized national database. There was no way to digitally compare evidence like shoe prints, blood types, or crime scene behavior across jurisdictions. Local law enforcement in Aurora, Lakewood, Henderson, and Mesquite had to manually share files and findings. Because of poor inter-agency communication, these connections were made late, well after the crimes had occurred. Witnesses were virtually non-existent. The one glimmer of hope, Vanessa Bennett, remained a tragic figure. Her survival inspired media headlines calling her the only light in a house of darkness. But emotionally and neurologically, she could offer no help to police. Her memory was gone. Her trauma was permanent. Investigators were left with just three things: blood, footprints, and patterns. In the Patricia Smith case, her daughter and granddaughter found the body, but hadn't heard anything unusual. Even the Hobbenschilds, who survived their attack, couldn't describe the assailant. He had moved in silence, in darkness, leaving no physical impression. No murder weapon was ever recovered in any of the three primary cases. The attacker brought his hammer with him, and took it when he left. This robbed investigators of vital forensic opportunities, like fingerprints, blood residue, or trace evidence from the weapon. His foresight and discipline suggested a higher than average level of criminal control. The absence of motive made the crimes even harder to decode. No valuables were taken. No known grudges or personal connections tied the victims to a suspect. No political or religious agenda was evident. The only consistent factor was sexual violence and a need to dominate. With no clear why, law enforcement had no logical trail to follow. The killer's psychological profile added further confusion. He blended traits from both organized and disorganized offenders. His clean exits, blanket staging, and removal of weapons suggested planning and control. But his extreme rage and random victim targeting, especially toward children, hinted at severe mental instability. This contradiction made the FBI's early profiles less precise than they needed. Complicating matters, no matching suspect appeared in any local or state record. Alex Ewing wasn't a Colorado resident. He wasn't on any work logs. He had no known association with the neighborhoods, and no one had seen him. He existed as a ghost, a man with no history, no ties, and no face. Finally, the cross-state nature of the crimes introduced jurisdictional chaos. The attacks occurred in Lakewood and Aurora, Colorado, and Henderson, Nevada. But without concrete evidence of federal violation, the FBI couldn't officially take over. Local agencies lacked the resources to conduct an interstate manhunt on their own. At last, the FBI's behavioral analysis painted a disturbing portrait of the man they were hunting. He was likely a white male in his early 20s, with limited formal education. He wasn't highly intelligent in the academic sense, but he was cunning, calculated, and capable of extreme violence. This was someone who didn't stalk his victims or plan around specific targets. Instead, he looked for opportunity, houses with unlocked doors, open garages, neighborhoods near vacant lots. Once inside, his pattern followed a chilling sequence: break-in, attack, sexually assault, and, sometimes, ransack the home. The FBI believed he may have worked in construction or a trade where hammers and tools were common, familiar enough with homes to navigate them in silence. But underneath that rough exterior was something darker, a predator driven by impulse, not necessity. He didn't kill for gain. He killed because he wanted to. Even with everything the FBI learned, the case eventually went cold. The killer vanished, and justice would have to wait for over 30 years. Reveal the murderer. For nearly 2 decades after the Bennett family murders, the case remained ice cold. Despite behavioral profiling and forensic effort, investigators had no name, no face, and no clear path forward. But then came science. In 2002, advancements in forensic DNA technology offered a glimmer of hope. Investigators re-examined the semen sample collected from Melissa Bennett's body. This time, they were able to create a full DNA profile, a genetic fingerprint of the killer. Unfortunately, that profile didn't match anyone in the National COBIS database at the time. The evidence was preserved, waiting silently for its match. Meanwhile, physical evidence from multiple crime scenes continued to quietly build the case. Bloody shoe prints found at the Bennett home, the Hobbenchild residence in Nevada, and another Nevada crime scene were carefully logged. Though not enough to identify a suspect, FBI experts analyzed the tread pattern, wear, and size, suspecting they belonged to the same man. Years later, these prints would play a key role when matched to a crime scene involving a man already in prison, Alex Ewing. In the 2010s, CODIS underwent a massive expansion. The FBI began collecting and uploading DNA from a broader range of convicts, especially those incarcerated for violent crimes, sexual assault, and burglary. Among those sampled was Alex Ewing, who had been sitting in a Nevada prison since 1984 for an unrelated home invasion. His DNA was added to the system, and that's when everything changed. In 2018, the match finally happened. Ewing's DNA was a perfect match to the Bennett family crime scene. Investigators in Colorado, reeling from the discovery, immediately tested the DNA against evidence from the Patricia Smith case. That, too, came back positive. For the first time in 34 years, authorities had a name and a face to attach to the carnage. Ewing wasn't just a suspect, he was the link between some of the most horrifying crimes in Colorado history. With Ewing identified, investigators reviewed his behavioral patterns and compared them with the long-standing FBI profile built in the mid-80s. The match was uncanny. He targeted homes with unlocked entrances, struck victims in the head with a hammer, and staged bodies with blankets, hallmarks of a signature, not just a modus operandi. The psychological footprint was as clear as the physical one. Everything aligned. However, not all the evidence stood the test of time. Some older crime scenes, possibly linked to Ewing, no longer had viable DNA samples. Whether due to contamination, loss, or degradation, those cases remain unconfirmed. Despite strong behavioral similarities, forensic closure was impossible without physical evidence. Still, the match from Bennett and Patricia Smith's cases stood strong. The puzzle, long fragmented and dust-covered, had finally begun to come together, piece by piece. through science, perseverance, and the unshakable will to uncover the truth. Alex Ewing. For over 3 decades, Alex Ewing remained completely off the radar. Despite committing some of the most brutal crimes in Colorado history, his name never once surfaced during the original investigations. The reason wasn't a lack of effort from law enforcement, it was because Ewing, for all intents and purposes, didn't exist on paper in any meaningful way. There are no known records of Ewing's childhood. No details about where he grew up, his family, or his early life ever made it into any public or police files. His past was a blank slate. Ewing had no presence in Aurora or Lakewood, the 2 key Colorado locations where the murders took place. He wasn't a local, didn't have family in the area, wasn't employed there, and didn't appear in any municipal or law enforcement databases. He was an out-of-state drifter, a man who moved from place to place, state to state, without notice. His transience was a major reason why the FBI's behavioral profile in the 1980s described the killer as someone likely not from the community. Still, without any identifying data, Ewing stayed invisible. What made Ewing even harder to trace was the nature of his crimes. He left little behind. His crimes were controlled and methodical, yet deeply savage. An unusual combination that initially blurred his classification as either an organized or disorganized offender. Because of all this, law enforcement agencies focused their early investigations on local suspects, neighbors, co-workers, known offenders. It wasn't until science caught up, and his DNA was finally entered into CODIS, that the pieces of the puzzle began to align. But by then, more than 30 years had passed, and Ewing had slipped through the cracks of multiple investigations. Though rarely mentioned by name, his criminal record sends chills down the spine, marked by sheer brutality and a staggering number of assaults carried out in just a matter of days. Between January 4th and January 16, 1984, Alex Ewing left a trail of violence across Colorado that would haunt investigators for decades. This spree was started with the first linked cases. It began on January 4th in Aurora. It was the case of the Haubenschild family. Just 6 days later, on January 10th, Ewing struck again, this time in Lakewood. His victim, 50-year-old Patricia Smith. On the same day, Donna, a flight attendant, had just pulled into her garage when the predator struck. There was no warning, no words, just the sound of the car door, and then the crushing blow of a hammer. He dragged her out of the driver's seat and struck her in the head. Hard, fast, brutal. A 2-pronged hammer, likely the same kind used in the Bennett and Patricia Smith attacks. Then he sexually assaulted her, methodically and silently. Somehow, Donna survived. Neighbors found her crumpled near the steps leading into her home, barely conscious, covered in blood. She had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. Her skull was fractured. Her body showed evidence of sexual assault. She had lost a dangerous amount of blood. But the worst part, she remembered nothing. The trauma had erased it all. When questioned by police, she couldn't recall even pulling into the garage. The hours after the attack were a complete void. And in that void, the attacker vanished. For months, Donna struggled to recover, not just physically, but emotionally. The aftermath followed her into every corner of her life. PTSD took hold. Every time she entered a garage, panic came rushing back. Darkness became unbearable. Being alone felt like a sentence. Years later, with fragments of memory slowly returning, she began working with detectives and FBI profilers. Donna couldn't identify her attacker by name or face, but her descriptions of the silence, the violence, and the speed matched the signature behavior long believed to belong to Alex Ewing. The same cold calculation, the same controlled cruelty. Back to the killings. In the early morning hours of January 15th into the 16th, Ewing committed his most heinous crime, the murder of the Bennett family. Bruce, Debra, and their 7-year-old daughter Melissa died. Their youngest child, 3-year-old Vanessa, was left clinging to life. In just under 2 weeks, Ewing had moved silently across multiple cities, attacking entire families, sexually assaulting, murdering, and vanishing without leaving behind anything that could tie his name to the horror. After a series of brutal attacks in Colorado, throughout January 1984, Alex Ewing continued his rampage as he moved across state lines, leaving behind a trail of violence that revealed both his erratic behavior and the terrifying consistency of his methods. On January 27, 1984, just days after the Bennett family murders, Ewing struck again, this time in Kingman, Arizona. His victim was Roy Williams, an older man attacked in his own home. Without warning or provocation, Ewing assaulted Roy with a large stone, bludgeoning his head and chest repeatedly. The sheer force of the assault required over 100 stitches to close Roy's wounds. Miraculously, Roy survived, but Ewing vanished from the scene, fleeing Arizona before authorities could connect him to any other cases. Then, on February 2, 1984, Ewing was arrested in Mesquite, Nevada, following a separate home invasion and assault. At the time, this incident wasn't tied to the Colorado attacks, as forensic evidence hadn't yet linked the cases. He was held locally, awaiting extradition to Arizona to face charges for the attack on Roy Williams. However, in August 1984, as he was being transported through Utah, Ewing managed to escape custody during a stop at a rest area, a serious breach of prisoner security. That very night, he broke into the home of Nancy and Chris Berry, a married couple living in Utah. Armed with an axe handle, he viciously beat both victims, inflicting severe injuries. Though both survived, the attack mirrored the frenzied violence of his previous crimes. Ewing didn't steal anything, he inflicted pain and fled, consistent with his now recognized profile as a rage-driven predator, not a thief. Over the next 4 days, Ewing eluded law enforcement, moving across rural terrain, dehydrated and exhausted. He was finally recaptured at a public phone booth, attempting to call his brother. By then, he was too weak to run any farther. What makes these out-of-state attacks particularly chilling is the speed and frequency with which they occurred. Within just a few weeks, Ewing moved from Colorado to Arizona to Nevada to Utah, committing at least 5 violent assaults in that short span. His means of travel remain unclear, but it's evident he had access to transportation and was intentionally avoiding staying in one place too long. Though his weapons varied, from hammers to rocks to axe handles, his methods remained the same, targeting vulnerable people in their homes, striking them brutally in the head and upper body, and leaving no opportunity for warning or defense. Whether he used a hammer, a stone, or a piece of wood, his intent was always the same: disable, dominate, and disappear. Notably, the later attacks, such as those in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, no longer involved sexual assault, a possible shift in behavior that may have been influenced by increased fear of capture or injuries sustained in prior struggles. These incidents painted a portrait of a predator becoming increasingly unhinged and erratic, yet still dangerously effective. Perhaps most tragically, in the case of Nancy and Chris Berry, both survived, providing law enforcement with a rare chance to understand Ewing's behavior from living witnesses. Though they couldn't positively identify him at the time, their testimony about his silent, focused, and explosive nature helped support the behavioral profile that FBI analysts were beginning to piece together. These post-Colorado crimes marked the final phase of Ewing's active spree, one that ended not with an arrest based on evidence from Colorado, but rather with an impulsive phone call to family. It would take over 3 more decades before the full extent of his crimes came to light, thanks to advancements in DNA science. But by then, the damage was done, and his name was permanently etched into the darkest pages of America's true crime history. The sentences. In 1985, Alex Ewing was sentenced to 110 years in prison for a series of brutal offenses in Nevada and Utah, including attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and escape from custody. But at the time of his sentencing, no one in Colorado suspected his involvement in the far more chilling crimes committed just weeks earlier in Aurora and Lakewood. Despite the extreme violence of his crimes, there was no public record of any psychological evaluations or psychiatric diagnosis. No reports indicated that Ewing had ever been flagged for mental health concerns. Even though his actions showed clear signs of uncontrolled rage and impulsivity. This lack of psychological profiling may have deeper understanding of his motives, or the scope of his potential for further violence. Still, the courts did not take his actions lightly. Prosecutors and judges agreed on one thing: Alex Ewing was dangerous beyond rehabilitation. The 110-year sentence was one of the harshest in Nevada at the time for a non-homicide conviction. It was designed not to punish alone, but to isolate, to remove him from society permanently. In prison, Ewing became invisible. For decades, he showed no major disciplinary issues, caused no riots, and attacked no guards. His inmate file remained largely unremarkable, and that's exactly what made him disappear. With no infractions, no red flags, and no clear ties to unsolved crimes in other states, Ewing's name remained buried. After the DNA match in 2018, the legal system in Colorado immediately mobilized to bring Alex Ewing to justice. Prosecutors from both Arapahoe County, where the Bennett family was murdered, and Jefferson County, home to Patricia Smith's case, filed formal extradition requests to transfer Ewing from his prison in Nevada back to Colorado. However, this process faced immediate complications. Ewing refused extradition, initiating a long legal battle by filing appeals that challenged the constitutionality of his transfer and the admissibility of DNA evidence across state lines. Between 2018 and 2020, this resistance led to a series of hearings in Nevada courts. Ewing's legal team argued that his rights were being violated and tried to lay the transfer on technical grounds. Nevertheless, the Nevada Supreme Court ultimately rejected his appeals. They upheld the legitimacy of Colorado's claims, pointing to the strength of the DNA match and the necessity to pursue justice in such serious crimes. In August 2020, after nearly 2 years of legal delays, Ewing was finally extradited to Colorado under strict security. It was the first time he had returned to the state since the gruesome crimes of 1984. Upon arrival, he was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in the Bennett family case, and a separate count of first-degree murder in the Patricia Smith case. The 2 district attorneys' offices decided to try the Bennett case first due to its gravity and the emotional weight it carried in the community. The lead up to the trial was not without further delays. COVID-19 restrictions and ongoing legal motions pushed the proceedings back into 2021. During this time, both the prosecution and defense revisited nearly 4 decades of forensic evidence, witness reports, and behavioral analysis to build their cases. The trial officially began in July 2021. At trial, prosecutors laid out compelling evidence. They presented DNA samples that matched Ewing perfectly, behavioral profiling from the FBI that described his exact methods, and emotional testimony from Vanessa Bennett, the only surviving member of the Bennett family. The defense attempted to discredit the evidence by questioning the chain of custody and the reliability of samples that had been preserved since 1984. However, their arguments did not sway the jury. On August 6, 2021, Alex Ewing was convicted of the murders of Bruce, Debra, and Melissa Bennett. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that Ewing would spend the rest of his life in prison for the crimes that had haunted Colorado for more than 30 years. Following the Bennett conviction, Ewing was then formally charged in Jefferson County for the murder of Patricia Smith. He pleaded not guilty once again. Although a trial was pending as of the last update, the DNA evidence in this case also directly linked Ewing to the crime scene. This strengthened the belief that his conviction in the Smith case would be similarly conclusive. Despite expressing intent to appeal the verdicts, Ewing's legal team has not succeeded in overturning or altering any of the outcomes. No appellate court has found grounds to reverse his convictions. The legal resolution of Alex Ewing's crime serves as a powerful example of how forensic science, particularly DNA technology, and persistent cross-jurisdictional cooperation can finally bring justice, even after decades of silence. The case emphasized the importance of national DNA databases and exposed the weaknesses of past systems that allowed a serial predator to escape detection for so long. The future of the survivor. Vanessa Bennett was only 3 years old when a stranger entered her family home in Aurora, Colorado, and shattered her world forever. She was the sole survivor of the 1984 Bennett family massacre, a tragedy so brutal that even seasoned detectives struggled to make sense of it. Vanessa, but she did. Her survival came with an irreversible cost. The attack left her with permanent cognitive impairments, including damage to the areas of her brain responsible for memory and emotional regulation. Vanessa underwent multiple surgeries to repair the physical disfigurement from the hammer blows. For the rest of her life, she would suffer from memory loss, developmental delays, and psychological trauma. She never regained any memory of the night her family was taken from her. Growing up, Vanessa displayed deep, rooted fear responses, anxiety triggered by darkness, loud noises, or the metallic sound of objects clashing. She often experienced emotional paralysis in the face of loss or sadness and struggled with unexplained guilt, as if some part of her subconsciously carried the weight of surviving when no one else did. Her life has been shaped by that night, physically, emotionally, and socially. Vanessa was never able to live independently. She has always relied on extended family and a legal guardian for daily support. Her social interactions have remained limited. There is no public record of her ever having and yet, in the eyes of the public, Vanessa became a symbol. Journalists and prosecutors referred to her as the light that survived. She was not just a victim, but a living thread, one that tied together decades of cold case investigations, courtrooms, and whispered prayers for justice. Her continued presence kept the memory of the Bennett family alive. It reminded investigators that there was still one witness to the unimaginable, even if that witness couldn't speak of it. In 2021, over 36 years after, and so we are left with questions, some legal, others deeply human. Can someone who survived but remembers nothing ever truly heal? What does life look like when your earliest memories are police reports? And has anyone ever asked Vanessa if she wants to remember? Or if forgetting is her only form of peace? Can delayed justice soothe a lifetime of silent grief? How do you learn to trust again when the last faces you saw were lost to violence? Vanessa Bennett's story is not only one of unimaginable suffering. It is a quiet, haunting testament to resilience, an enduring reminder that some scars, though hidden, shape everything that comes after. The use of DNA technology. It is clear that DNA technology is a key factor for telling the truth in this case. Imagine this: a single strand of hair, a drop of saliva, a tiny trace of blood, invisible to the naked eye, holds the power to solve a murder or to destroy a life. In the span of just a few decades, forensic DNA technology has transformed from a scientific marvel into a cornerstone of modern criminal justice. Once used cautiously, it is now wielded confidently by courts and investigators as the ultimate truth teller. Since the late 1980s, this technology has not only revolutionized how we solve crimes, it has redefined the very meaning of evidence. Before DNA, criminal investigations often relied on fragile variables, eyewitnesses with fading memories, unreliable confessions, or speculative forensic methods like hair comparison and bite mark analysis. But with the rise of genetic profiling, science began to offer something radically different: a way to trace identity at the molecular level. In many cases, it has turned the tides of justice. One of the most celebrated benefits of DNA technology is its unmatched ability to identify the guilty with precision. A single drop of blood, a strand of hair, a trace of saliva, when analyzed properly, can link a suspect to a crime scene with astonishing accuracy. The case of Joseph James D'Angelo, known as the Golden State Killer, illustrates this power. For decades, he eluded law enforcement while committing a series of rapes and murders across California during the 1970s and 80s. Traditional methods failed to uncover his identity, but in 2018, investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA to an open, source ancestry database. Through forensic genetic genealogy, Tracing relatives and constructing family trees, they zeroed in on D'Angelo, a former police officer. The arrest was a watershed moment, a 40-year-old cold case finally solved, not through confession or coincidence, but by science and statistical certainty. But perhaps even more impactful than identifying the guilty is forensic DNA's role in exonerating the innocent, in saving lives that would otherwise be wrongfully taken by the justice system. The case of Peter Sullivan stands as a haunting reminder of this power. In 1987, Sullivan was convicted for the rape and murder of 21-year-old Diane Sindall in Merseyside, England. The evidence against him was weak and deeply flawed. A confession taken without legal counsel, and bite mark analysis, a forensic method now widely discredited. For nearly 4 decades, Sullivan maintained his innocence. He endured prison, stigma, and hopeless appeals. It wasn't until 2021 that the Criminal Cases Review Commission agreed to re-examine the case using modern DNA testing. The results were irrefutable. Biological evidence collected from the crime scene showed no trace of Sullivan's DNA. In 2025, his conviction was officially overturned. At 68 years old, he walked free, his name cleared, but with 38 years of his life lost forever. Without the advancement of DNA science, Peter Sullivan would have died in prison, a man forgotten by time, silenced by error. Cases like Sullivan's demonstrate a critical truth. DNA isn't just about catching criminals. It's about correcting wrongs. Across the United States, organizations like the Innocence Project have used DNA testing to overturn over 300 wrongful convictions, many of them involving death row inmates. These aren't isolated errors. They are systemic failures, and DNA has become the most powerful tool to expose them. Another crucial benefit of DNA technology lies in its ability to revive cold cases, crimes long unsolved due to lack of evidence or outdated methods. With newer techniques like touch DNA and low copy number analysis, even trace amounts of biological material can yield results. Take, for example, the murder of 16-year-old Colette Aram in Nottinghamshire, UK, in 1983. For decades, the case went cold. But in 2009, police ran DNA contact from the crime scene through the national database. A partial match came up. Not the killer himself, but his son, who had recently been arrested for an unrelated offense. This led to the arrest of Paul Hutchinson, who confessed to the crime. A family finally got the closure they had been denied for more than 25 years, all thanks to DNA. The same principle applied in the case of Gary Ridgway, the infamous Green River Killer. Between the early 1980s and the late 1990s, Ridgway murdered dozens of women in Washington state. For years, he managed to avoid capture. But in 2001, forensic scientists used DNA from preserved evidence, some over 2 decades old, and matched it to Ridgway. He eventually confessed to killing 71 women. Without DNA preservation and technological advancement, Ridgway might have escaped justice entirely. Beyond solving and exonerating, forensic DNA has also transformed the way investigators work, enabling them to build smarter strategies. Previously, suspects were often targeted based on proximity. One of the most persistent misconceptions about DNA is that it is infallible, that a DNA match is the final word. But in reality, the collection, preservation, interpretation, and presentation of DNA evidence is a deeply complex process vulnerable to contamination, mislabeling, or misinterpretation. A single error at any stage can shift the outcome of an entire trial. And because DNA is held in such high regard, jurors may be more likely to overlook flaws in the surrounding evidence if the word DNA is spoken in court. In some cases, cross-contamination, where biological material from one sample accidentally transfers to another, can lead to false accusations. DNA is incredibly sensitive. It can be transferred through a handshake, left on a doorknob, or carried into a scene on an investigator's clothing or tools. One of the most bizarre examples of this problem emerged from Germany in what became known as the Phantom of Heilbronn case. For years, German and Austrian police believed they were chasing a female serial killer whose DNA appeared at dozens of crime scenes across countries. As it turned out, the cotton swabs used to collect evidence were contaminated during manufacturing by a worker at the factory. there was no serial killer. Just flawed tools and a misunderstanding of how easily DNA can mislead when treated carelessly. Another chilling example for that idea was the case of John Ben Ramsey, which shows how DNA can mislead justice when treated as infallible. A partial male DNA sample on her clothing shifted focus away from suspicious evidence, like the ransom note and family inconsistencies. Though experts warned it could be contamination, authorities used it to clear the Ramseys. This over-reliance on weak DNA evidence sent the case spiraling into dead ends, while stronger leads were ignored. Another troubling scenario is when DNA becomes the only evidence used to convict someone. While a strong DNA match can be compelling, it does not always prove guilt. DNA merely shows that a person's genetic material was present at a location, not when, why, or how it got there. And in some cases, that presence is innocent. In Victor Neelan's case in the UK, he was convicted of attempted rape in 1996 based on weak circumstantial evidence and eyewitness identification. He maintained his innocence for 17 years. In 2013, DNA testing on the victim's clothing revealed a completely different male profile, not Neelan's. Despite the absence of any other credible evidence, he had spent nearly 2 decades in prison. This case underscores a painful truth: the absence of DNA can be ignored, and the presence of DNA can be misunderstood. Either way, the consequences are catastrophic. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of DNA's rise is the illusion of certainty it creates. In the eyes of juries, judges, and even investigators, DNA evidence can carry an almost mythological weight. Once introduced in a courtroom, it may overshadow every other piece of evidence, even if the collection process was flawed or the context was misrepresented. This phenomenon is sometimes referred to as DNA bias. It's not that the science itself is flawed, but that the people interpreting it may give it more authority than it deserves. Forensic scientists, under pressure from law enforcement or public expectations, may interpret ambiguous results in favor of the prosecution. Lab technicians may rush or even falsify results, as was the case in the Annie Dookhan scandal, where a Massachusetts chemist tampered with evidence in over 34,000 criminal cases. When science becomes entangled with bias, ambition, or institutional pressure, it loses its integrity. This is not an argument against DNA. Through real-world cases, both heroic and heartbreaking, we must understand what DNA can truly do, and what it cannot, in the fragile, flawed system of criminal justice. Because in the pursuit of truth, science must never become the substitute for judgment. The case of Alex Ewing is a dark truth we must confront. The most horrific predators often blend into the shadows precisely because they know where to strike. And in some random days, they will come for us. If there is a lesson to be drawn, it is this: public safety is not passive. It must be active, vigilant, and relentless. We must do more to strengthen national databases, improve communication between state agencies, and treat violent offenders with the seriousness their behavior demands. Beside that, violence against women and children is not rare. It is persistent, systemic, and deadly. And when our systems fail to detect, prevent, or respond, it is these groups who pay the highest price. But beyond prevention and prosecution, there is something deeper we owe to those who lived. Vanessa Bennett, for example, did not ask to become a symbol of survival. She simply was left behind, scarred in ways we may never fully understand. Survivors of violent crimes like hers carry invisible burdens long after headlines fade. Justice cannot end at the verdict. True justice means sustained support, trauma-informed care, long-term psychological services, protected housing, and community networks that do not forget. We failed the Bennett family in 1984. But we have a chance, now, not to fail others. Let this case be a turning point, not just in forensic history, but in how we think about violence, vulnerability, and the quiet, persistent courage of those who endure.